Hello and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, your go-to podcast for everything soilless cultivation. Now, when we think of hydroponics, many people will think of indoor growing, so growing in a grow tent, a grow room, or even a warehouse. But hydroponics also covers polytunnels, it can cover outdoors, and it can also cover greenhouses or glasshouses. We tend to say glasshouses in horticulture, even when they are not made of glass. So today we're going to talk about choosing the right material for your greenhouse, the skin and the skeleton. So the skin, we think of that as the glass, but it could be another option. We'll look at optimizing light, longevity, cost, and also insulation, which is often not thought about. So the first option is single pane glass, standard and low iron options. Excellent scratch resistance and lifespan. They do last decades if you treat them well, and they are lucky that they don't get smashed in a weather storm or from your children hitting a football or somebody else smashing them. They will last a long time. They transmit high quality light and with good clarity, so around 98% transmission. They have better insulation than some of the alternatives. However, they're not as well insulated as, say, your double glazing in your house. They have duller hemispheric light and cannot be drilled, and they're heavy. I don't know what hemispheric light is. Answers on a postcard, please, for that one. But yeah, they can be cleaned, though, and they can be cleaned with some very aggressive chemicals. So traditionally, they would use some really nasty acids to clean them and make sure that there was no algae or dirt build up on them, and the transmission could stay at around 98%. So that's what they do commercially on big glass houses, and now they're starting to use drones to clean them as well, so spraying the chemicals on. You could potentially use double paned or even double glazing with a gas-filled option for added insulation. However, that is expensive, and you'd really have to be a heavy user of expensive heat to make that worthwhile. So that's not. If you really want good insulation, then you're probably going to use polycarbonate, which is the sort of thing that you'll see. It's got looks like a ladder side on. It's used in the UK in conservatory constructions, and you can get opaque versions and transparent versions. And for a greenhouse, you want a transparent version. The thing about this one is it's got good insulation, because it traps the air in that twin wall panel. It's also impact resistant. So if you in an area where you know things are going to hit your greenhouse, then you'd struggle to get anything to go through it. You can walk on this if it's secured in place. You're not going to snap in two, but it might come away at the seams. That's the other thing to consider. There's a famous story about a executive in a high rise in New York, and he took a load of his kids from his kids go to school, and they went on a school trip, brought all the kids into this high rise, and he was showing them the skyscraper, and he said, look, this glass is so strong, if I ran up and jumped up against it, it wouldn't break. And he took a big long run up and he jumped up against it and it didn't break. And the problem was it came away at the seams, and he fell to his death in front of his kids and all their friends. So yeah, don't jump on a polycarbonate greenhouse because it may give way. You see people walking on single pane glasshouse roofs, and that someone who's scared of heights, that does, scare me. It's not something that I would ever do. I have a mixture in my greenhouse of polycarbonate for the roof and glass for the walls. And it can be a good option if you know you're going to make it opaque. So sometimes you put whitewash onto the glass so that to diffuse the light. If you're going to do that anyway, then polycarbonate could be a good option. You could just get a diffuse version of that polycarbonate that comes as standard for the likes of conservatories and side buildings and things like this. So polycarbonate could be a good option there. Also, if you don't want people to see into your greenhouse, rather than putting whitewash on, which washes off over time, you could use a opaque polycarbonate. Well, not opaque, but what's the word I'm looking for? It transmits light, but you can't see through it. Whatever that one is. Frosted, that's the word. You could also use one-way film on the glass. However, that's going to absorb a lot of light, so you're not going to get anywhere near that transmission you would if you didn't have a filter on it. You can use acrylic plastic to uses the skin of a greenhouse. However, acrylic, or is known in the US, plexiglass, it's lightweight, excellent optical clarity, medium insulation, weather resistant, less prone to yellowing than polycarbonate, but modern polycarbonates don't yellow very much, to be fair. However, it can go on fire. So if you've got lights in there, LED lights or sodium lamps, then, you might struggle to get insurance for that. And, you might want to consider that your greenhouse could go up in flames. Tends to not be used very often, acrylic, really. Cheaper greenhouses tend to use acrylic. So that's something to bear in mind. You can use film or PVC coating, PVC options. So like you would in a polytunnel, at very low cost, very lightweight, very quick to install, but a short lifespan, 1 to 4 years, not durable, and they don't filter out UV. So you might get lower yields, but higher value crop. They also get a lot of condensation on them. So that's something to consider. That drops down onto your crop and you can get grey mold. Now, a really good option is like film or PVC that's into like bubble wrap, like that you would get in packaging. Now, a very, very strong version of that is used in the UK, a firm called Keder, Keder. Keder greenhouses are really strong, and because they use this reinforced bubble wrap type material to make sort of a cross between a polytunnel and a greenhouse. They're like really expensive polytunnels. They're not cheap, but they are very, very resistant to mechanical damage. So they're used in like the really northern Scottish islands, like the Shetlands and the Orkney Isles, for growing crops up there, where they can struggle for a lot of the year. And there, light transmission is not so much of an issue. It's more insulation, increasing the growing season without having to use heating and things like this, expensive heating. So Keder greenhouses are something that would be on my list of things that I would like to invest in. A nice Keder greenhouse. They're really good for filming things in as well, not just like a greenhouse. Much better than a polytunnel. We've got like vertical walls. It's more like a greenhouse. When it comes to the structural material, aluminium is now by far the most common type because it's lightweight, corrosive resistant, low maintenance, and clean. So you don't need to, and you can clean it easily. It's cost effective compared to wood, much easier to handle and assemble. It's got a lower thermal mass, which can be a disadvantage, can amplify internal heating and cold. So if you've got a plastic cladding, then that could degrade when it's close to the aluminium. You could use galvanized steel. It's another option. It's strong and stable, ideal for large commercial structures. So like for really tall greenhouses, you can anchor heavy glazing panels without bending. However, it is by its nature heavier and prone to rusting without protection. The galvanized will wear off and more expensive to install. The traditional amateur material or even commercial material was cedar wood or redwood in America. That was used, mainly cedar in the UK. Provides some sort of natural insulation to a bit. The reason why it was used is it's visually appealing. A red cedar greenhouse looks great. That's what I've got. It's easy to work with and DIY friendly. It's rot resistant, red cedar, especially if you treat it, but that could potentially leach chemicals and things like that. My greenhouse is as old as me. It was handed down to me from my father, so I've still got the same greenhouse, so it does last a long time. It doesn't rot. However, it has had a few things replaced over the years. It's getting close to the end of its life now. You could potentially have plastic or fiberglass greenhouses. These would be at the low end, low cost options. They're corrosion resistant, but they're just less durable. They warp and they don't have good structural strength compared to aluminium, steel or wood. So, I would probably, if I'm going to replace my greenhouse, I'm probably going to go for a Keder, which would be aluminium poles with a high-end plastic sort of bubble wrap filter on it. If I wasn't going to go for that, I'd probably go for an aluminium glass, but with coverings on it to prevent the glass from breaking, because I've got young kids. That's something to consider with glass, is that, they are going to hit footballs and golf balls and cricket balls, in my case, at the greenhouse. And so I have to put a plastic covering over the walls of my greenhouse and have a polycarbonate roof because of that, because I don't want glass flying everywhere. And obviously it's going to be harmful to the people near and around who get exposed to that glass. And also if it goes onto the inside the greenhouse and you got potential for contamination of the crop and things like that. So that's something to consider. So there's different positives and negatives. A lot of people, when they start designing their own greenhouse, they start to look at acrylic, and you'll see people with like making greenhouses out of old doors or old materials, and they'll start using acrylic and things like this, but they don't last long. So really, I'd really go for polycarbonate. Polycarbonate is harder to shape than acrylic. So it's much more difficult to produce things like triangles or curves than it is in acrylic or glass. If you want to cut glass, you can normally take them to a hardware store, an old school hardware store. Just phone up and ask them if they cut glass. They'll cut it to any shape you want, rather than trying to do it at home. If you're not an expert in cutting glass, then it can be expensive and dangerous. So that's my thoughts on glasshouse materials. There's potential for using films, spectral films, to increase different light levels. That's been used in the past. However, now with LED lights, you could just put a tunable light in there to increase the spectrum of a certain wavelength of light. So something there to consider for both commercial and hobby greenhouses. I've been Dr. Russell Sharp. You've been listening to Hydroponics Daily. And if you could share this podcast, it would mean the world. Get my listener figures up. I've recorded about 6 of these podcasts this morning because I'm going on holiday to Holland. So hopefully one of the next few podcasts will be about the Dutch flower auctions, which I'm hoping to go to because they're right next door to where we are staying. So fingers crossed I'll get into one of those. They're not cheap to go into. I think they're about 50 euros. So we'll see. You have to get up really early, which I'm not looking forward to either. So, but the early bird gets the worm when it comes to flower auctions. So watch this space. Thank you very much for listening. Until tomorrow, goodbye.